A single blast furnace in 1750 could produce 500 tons of iron a year. An entire blacksmith's forge, with its skilled craftsmen hammering from dawn to dusk, produced 5. Think about that for a moment. One machine. 100 times the output. That sounds like the definition of progress. Here's what they didn't tell you. By 1750, the Weald of Kent and Sussex, once the largest continuous ancient forest in southern England, a cathedral of oak and hornbeam stretching 120 miles from Hampshire to the Kent coast, had been reduced to less than a third of its original coverage. The Forest of Dean, stripped, Sherwood, diminished beyond recognition. The new forest, raided to its margins, not by farmers, not by cities, by furnaces. How does a machine that forged the cannons that won Britain's wars, cast the bells in every parish church, and supplied the iron that held the Royal Navy together, also become the instrument that nearly erased 1,000 years of living woodland from the English landscape? That is the question nobody asked at the time. They were too busy watching the iron pour. Here is what makes it worse. It wasn't simply greed, though. There was plenty of that. It was geometry. A single blast furnace required roughly 500 acres of managed coppice woodland just to keep itself running for 1 year. Not to expand, not to increase output, just to stay lit. Britain had approximately 300 furnaces operating by 1700. Do the arithmetic yourself. The forest was not being consumed carelessly. It was being consumed mathematically, acre by acre, at a rate the land could not absorb. The men who lived inside that calculation knew it better than anyone. The charcoal colliers, the seasonal workers who felled, stacked, and slow-burned the wood inside their smoldering turf hearths deep in the forest, had a saying that passed down through generations of the trade. The furnace eats, it never sleeps, and it never thanks you. They were right on all 3 counts. Before this is over, you will see the man who broke that equation, a Quaker ironmaster in a Shropshire valley, who found a way to feed the furnace without touching another tree. You will see what his solution built. You will see the iron bridge that still stands over the River Severn, cast from his furnace in 1779, and you will understand what it cost to put it there. The forests survived. Something else did not. This is the story of the blast furnace, the machine that stripped Britain's ancient woodland bare, and the world it made from the ashes. Picture a stone shaft rising 30 feet from the valley floor, 10 feet wide at its belly, tapering toward a throat at the top where the charge goes in. The walls are 2 feet thick, mortared rubble and fire brick, and they glow, not metaphorically. The stone itself radiates heat. You can feel 20 feet away, a pressure against your face like opening an oven. Except the oven is the size of a house, and it has been running without interruption for 4 months. This is the blast furnace, and once you understand what happens inside it, you will understand exactly why it needed to eat what it ate. Charges of iron ore, charcoal, and limestone are loaded from the top in alternating layers, basket by basket, hour after hour. At the base, a water wheel drives a set of leather bellows the size of small boats, forcing a continuous blast of cold air through iron pipes called tuyères, punched into the base of the stack. The air hits the burning charcoal at temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. At that heat, the limestone begins to strip sulfur and silica from the ore. Carbon from the charcoal bonds with oxygen, producing carbon monoxide gas, which tears the oxygen molecules away from the iron oxide and leaves behind something new. Liquid iron, pooling at the base of the stack, heavier than the slag floating above it, waiting to be released. Twice a day, the founder, the man responsible for the entire operation, approached the tap hole at the base of the furnace with a long iron rod and broke it open. Iron at 2,700 degrees poured in a blinding orange river into channels cut into the sand floor, branching into smaller molds that cooled into solid bars. They called the shape pig iron because the molds looked like piglets feeding from a sow. The founder's face was wrapped in wet cloth. It was not enough. Every experienced founder bore the record of his work in scar tissue across his forearms and hands. The furnace could not be shut down between batches. Cooling and reheating cracked the stonework. Once lit, it ran for months. The furnace dictated the calendar, the workforce, the woodland for miles in every direction. 1 ton of pig iron required 8 tons of charcoal. 1 ton of charcoal required 4 tons of wood. 500 tons of iron meant the permanent consumption of 500 acres of coppice every single year. The furnace didn't negotiate. It didn't conserve. It calculated, and the forest paid the bill. What the furnace was burning was not just wood. It is important to understand that before anything else. The forests of pre-industrial England were not wild places. They were working landscapes, managed by the same families across generations, cut on careful 15 to 20-year rotations that allowed the trees to regrow from their roots. The same stools of oak and hazel that a man's grandfather had cut, his grandson would cut again. The woodland had its own economy, its own people, its own rhythm. Charcoal burners, tanners, coopers, hurdle makers, glass makers, all of them drew their living from the same acres, season after season, century after century. The forest was not a resource waiting to be used. It was already in use. Had been for 1,000 years. The Weald of Kent and Sussex was the heart of it. 120 miles long, 30 miles wide, dense with ironstone and ancient oak. The Romans had smelted iron here. The Normans had hunted here. By 1600, there were 60 furnaces operating in the Weald alone. 60 furnaces, each one hungry, each one running its own arithmetic against the trees. John Evelyn saw where it was going. In 1664, he published a book called Silva and placed it directly in front of King Charles II. His argument was simple and cold. At the current rate of consumption, England would run out of oak for Royal Navy ship timbers within a generation. The country was burning its strategic future to make cooking pots. Parliament responded with the first laws in British history designed to protect woodland. They were not enough. The men who lived deepest inside the problem were the charcoal colliers. They built low turf huts beside their burning hearths and lived in the forest for months at a time, sleeping near the slow-burning mounds, waking through the night to tend them. They breathed charcoal smoke from October to April. A lung disease the trade called collier's asthma was so common among them that it was not treated as an illness. It was treated as weather, something that came with the job, like cold mornings and wet boots. No one counted the colliers who died early. No one was keeping that record. As the woodland thinned, the furnaces moved, south to north, east to west, following the remaining trees. The Weald to the Forest of Dean. The Forest of Dean to the Welsh borders. The Welsh borders to the Lake District. Each move left a stripped landscape behind it and bought a few more decades of supply. By 1700, Britain was importing iron from Sweden and Russia. The forest-based industry was eating itself alive. Something had to give, and in a small valley in Shropshire, someone was already working on the answer. Abraham Darby was a Quaker ironmaster from Bristol who had spent years watching the same problem everyone else was watching and asking a different question. Not how do we find more woodland, but what if the furnace didn't need woodland at all? The answer he was moving toward was coke. Coal-baked, in a low-oxygen environment until the impurities burned away, leaving behind a porous, high-carbon fuel that burned hotter and cleaner than raw coal. Charcoal made from wood and coke made from coal were, in chemical terms, performing the same function inside the furnace. Carbon was carbon. The question was whether coke's impurities, particularly sulfur, would contaminate the iron and make it brittle. Everyone who had tried it before Darby had produced iron that cracked. Darby believed the problem was in the ore, not the coke. He was right. In 1709, at a small furnace in Coalbrookdale, Shropshire, on the steep wooded banks of the River Severn, Abraham Darby produced the first successful coke-smelted iron in history. He was quiet about it for years. The Quakers were not given to announcement, but the implications were staggering. Coal existed in Britain in quantities that dwarfed any calculation about woodland. The geometric stranglehold that had been tightening around the forest for a century was, in a single furnace, broken. Except it wasn't. Not immediately, not completely. Darby's coke iron was excellent for casting, pots, cylinders, heavy components, but it remained too brittle for wrought iron and most structural uses. The charcoal furnaces kept running. The forests kept paying. It took 40 more years, and Darby's son Abraham Darby II, to refine the process to the point where coke iron could begin replacing charcoal iron across the full range of applications. The revolution moved at the speed of inherited knowledge, passed father to son inside one Quaker family in one Shropshire valley. By 1779, Abraham Darby III cast the world's first iron bridge across the River Severn, 100 yards from his grandfather's original furnace. 378 tons of cast iron, assembled without a single bolt or nail, using carpentry joints translated into metal. It spanned 100 feet. It still stands. It became the symbol of everything the Industrial Revolution believed about itself, that ingenuity could replace limitation, that the material world could be remade by men who thought carefully enough. Coalbrookdale at night looked like a painting of hell that someone had decided to admire. Multiple furnaces burning simultaneously, the valley walls reflecting orange light across the River Severn, coal smoke rising black and thick where charcoal smoke had once risen gray and thin. The river ran with iron-orange runoff. The surrounding towns accumulated a permanent industrial smog that visitors described with a mixture of awe and unease. The forest was no longer being consumed. Something else was. Because coke required coal, and coal in Britain was essentially without limit, the old constraint on iron production simply ceased to exist. Output doubled, then doubled again. By 1800, Britain was producing 200,000 tons of iron a year. By 1850, 2.5 million. The numbers accelerated the way a furnace accelerates when you open the blast. Not gradually, but suddenly, past the point where anything feels controllable. The furnaces were no longer limited by how much woodland you could sustainably manage. They were limited by nothing. And the men who fed them were about to find out what unlimited production actually felt like from the inside. The Black Country got its name honestly. A 10-mile radius around Dudley in the West Midlands, by 1830 the most industrially dense landscape on Earth, where the coal seams ran so close to the surface that children dug them with their hands. No trees, no clean water. The sky the color of a bruise from horizon to horizon, permanently. Charles Dickens passed through and wrote that it was such a mass of dirt, gloom, and misery that he could not describe it adequately. He was not a man who struggled to find words. At the center of it, always, the blast furnace. The keeper was the man who ran it, the equivalent of the Bessemer blower, the single person whose judgment stood between a successful cast and catastrophe. He had no thermometer, no instruments of any kind. He read the furnace by the color of the flame at the top of the stack and the pitch of the blast coming through the tuyères. Too cold, and the iron chilled inside the hearth, freezing solid in a mass that required gunpowder to remove. Too hot, and the tuyères burned through, sending liquid iron spraying across the cast-house floor in every direction. The window of correct judgment was minutes wide. The keeper worked that window for 12 hours at a stretch, 6 days a week, in heat that regularly exceeded 120 degrees on the cast-house floor. The tapping itself was the most dangerous moment. Iron at 2,700 degrees running in open channels across the sand, slag floating on the surface, workers guiding the flow with long iron rods, faces turned sideways against the radiant heat. Burns were not accidents in the blast furnace trade. They were the texture of the work. Every experienced iron worker carried a permanent map of his career in scar tissue from wrist to elbow. A parliamentary inquiry in 1840 found that the average age of death for blast furnace workers in the Black Country was 36. Children as young as 8 worked the loading platforms on night shifts because the furnace ran continuously and someone had to fill it. Parliamentary testimony from 1842 records a boy of 9 describing his working hours without complaint, because complaint required the imagination of an alternative, and he had none. In 1850, Britain produced 2.5 million tons of iron. The forest was gone. The men were going. And the machine kept running because the machine was never the thing that decided when enough was enough. That decision belonged to the men who owned it. It always had. The blast furnace built the modern world. That is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. Every mile of Britain's 25,000-mile railway network was laid on cast and wrought iron before. Steel existed to replace it. The steamship hulls that carried British trade to every ocean were iron. The structural columns of the Crystal Palace, assembled in Hyde Park in 1851 as a monument to industrial civilization, were iron. The cannons at Waterloo were iron. The pipes that brought clean water into Victorian cities and ended the cholera epidemics that had killed tens of thousands. Iron. The gas mains under London streets. The machinery in every textile mill and flour mill and factory in the country. All of it came out of a stone shaft, 30 feet tall, burning day and night, fed by men whose names nobody recorded. Here is what it cost. By 1900, ancient woodland coverage in England had fallen to 5% of land area. In 1600, it had been 15. The Weald, once 120 miles of continuous oak and hornbeam, was farmland and suburb and railway cutting. The Forest of Dean survived only because the Crown had protected it for naval timber, not out of any instinct for conservation. The Black Country had no woodland at all. Some of this was agriculture. Some was urbanization. But the blast furnace started the clearance, and it started it fast, in a concentrated geographical burn that the landscape had no time to absorb. Ancient woodland cannot be recreated. That is the fact that sits at the center of this story and does not move. You can plant trees. Britain has planted millions of them, mostly conifers in rows, functional and silent. But ancient woodland is not trees. It is the accumulated ecology of centuries. The fungal networks running between root systems, the soil chemistry built over millennia, the species that live nowhere else and return from nowhere once they are gone. The trees can come back. The woodland cannot. The iron bridge at Coalbrookdale still stands. Cast in 1779 from Abraham Darby's furnace, 378 tons of iron over the River Severn, it has never been structurally repaired or replaced. The oak forest that covered those valley slopes when Darby first lit his furnace is gone. The bridge remains. We look at the world the blast furnace built and we see civilization, railways and cities and medicine and light. But underneath it, if you look closely enough, you will see the stumps. Miles of ancient forest, reduced to charcoal, reduced to iron, reduced to the world we live in now. The furnace is cold. Its work is permanent. Progress has a price. It always does. If you want to go deeper, the next video looks at the men who tried to stop it. The early conservationists, the parliamentary fighters, the woodland commoners who understood what was being lost before anyone in power was willing to listen. They didn't win, but they didn't disappear either. And the story of how their losing fight eventually became the foundation of every environmental protection law in the modern world is worth knowing.